I wanted to begin this khutbah mentioning a man by the name of Ayyub Sulaiman Diallo, rahimahullah ta'ala, also known as Job ben Solomon. And he was a famous Muslim who was a victim of the transatlantic slave trade. He was the descendant of Imams in Gambia. And he had gone to sell some cattle, and in the process, he was captured by a Mandingo tribe, and he was sold into slavery onto a boat that was destined to Maryland in the United States of America. And so him being an Imam himself, when he reached Maryland and he was sold to a tobacco plantation owner, his life took very unusual courses. It was very strange. He was sold, and the physical labor that he was supposed to do, he couldn't do it. He wasn't fit for it. And one day while he was praying, one of the children made fun of him and ridiculed him. And so he decided to flee. And when he fled, you can imagine what would happen to a slave who was recaptured. And he was recaptured. But all they did was put him in prison. None of the beating and the torture, none of that happened to Ayyub, rahimahullah. He was in prison, and there he met a lawyer, a British lawyer, who was impressed. He was so educated, he was so refined, he was so pious, this man. And he was impressed by the fact that he could read and write in Arabic. He was an Imam after all. That he could speak Arabic, that he was fluent in this language. And so he purchased him, and he took him with him to Britain. And Ayyub ibn Sulaiman, while in Britain, became the talk of the town. People were so impressed with his eloquence. They were impressed with the English that he had learned already. They were impressed by the fact that he could translate Arabic texts, and in fact, he wrote the Quran several times in Britain from memory in the 1700s. He was included into a gentleman's society of intellectual thinkers in Britain. And he was one of the few people who would eventually return home to Gambia from the slave trade. I wanted to begin sharing this story because Ayyub bin Sulaiman, his picture is famous, by the way. There's a famous portrait that was drawn of him. And when he was in Britain and they had drawn his portrait, just think about that. What slave has his portrait drawn like he's some sort of dignified person in the community? But that was him. And when the portrait was being drawn of him, he insisted on the painter. He said, "You have to draw me. Don't draw me in these British clothes that I'm wearing. You have to draw me in my traditional West African garb." And the painter said to him, "Well, how am I supposed to draw you in that? When I've never seen it, I don't know what it looks like. You're not wearing it." And so Ayyub rahimahullah began to describe to him what his garb was. And so when you see the painting, the picture's actually on the screens when you leave. It's a famous picture. You will see a man who is so dignified, and yet he's wearing clothes that he described, but he was insistent on it because of his dignity. And that dignity captured the imagination of Western abolitionists who used him as an argument and as a proof that the black man has a moral character that makes them deserving of equal rights of any white man in society. I wanted to talk today about history for a number of reasons. One, we're in Black History Month and it's important. But I wanted to begin by talking about general history. I know talking of history is old-fashioned. Literally, for many people it's not exciting. But there are a number of things. I want to share 3 things why it's important for us to know history. Number 1, with history you uncover the sunan of Allah. With history you understand the laws of Allah Azza wa Jalla that He has established on this earth. You recognize the patterns with which Allah Azza wa Jalla deals with people and deals with individuals and deals with communities and deals with nations. And so you have a head start over everyone else. When you've studied how Allah Azza wa Jalla has dealt with past nations, Allah Azza wa Jalla says, فَهَلْ يَنظُرُونَ إِلَّا سُنَّةَ الْأَوَّلِينَ فَلَنْ تَجِدَ لِسُنَّةِ اللَّهِ تَبْدِيلًا وَلَنْ تَجِدَ لِسُنَّةِ اللَّهِ تَحْوِيلًا. Allah says, do they expect the way of the former peoples? Do they expect anything except the way of the former people? You will not find in the way of Allah any change, and you will never find in the way of Allah any alteration. The second reason is because through history, you are inspired and you learn resolve. When you see what the human spirit has the capacity to overcome, when you see the trials that people faced before you, when you see the darkness that was met by generations before you, people who were no different than you and I, then you see the capacity of the human spirit. It gives you inspiration and it gives you resolve, and that is the reason why Allah Azza wa Jal mentions that He revealed the stories of the prophets. He says, وَكُلًّا نَقُصُّ عَلَيْكَ مِنْ أَنْبَاءِ الرُّسُلِ مَا نُثَبِّتُ بِهِ فُؤَادَكَ. Allah says, and we narrate to you the stories of the prophets to grant your heart resolve. When you see how the prophets, the trials that they met, and you see that the aqibah is truly for the muttaqeen, you see that they were successful, even if it was not in this life, that they were successful by holding on to their mabadi', that they were successful by holding on to their virtues and their beliefs until death. You see and you are inspired by their stories. And Allah Azza wa Jal doesn't just tell us the importance of these stories, but Allah Azza wa Jal makes a third of His final revelation stories for us to reflect upon. A third of the Quran is stories for us to learn about, for us to draw parallels and to analyze and to be inspired by. The third point of the importance of history is it gives you access to your identity. It lets you know on whose shoulders you're standing. It gives you the ability to be proud. I met a young man who was, at the time he was probably around 24, 25, and he was getting his PhD in African studies. And I asked him, why are you getting your PhD in this particular topic? And he said, when I was in high school, he was ethnically Somali. And he said, when I was in high school and everybody on the news, it was all talking about these Somali pirates. So he said, one of the kids in my class, he said to me, what have Somalis ever produced for mankind? What have your people ever done that was positive to mankind? And he said the question was very hurtful. But what was more hurtful was that I didn't have an answer for him. And so there are many of us who grow up like that. We don't have access to our history, and so if anyone were to simply ask us that question in our schools, our high schools, our elementary schools, our colleges even, and they ask us and they say, well, what have you Muslims ever produced for mankind? What have your community, your particular country, what have you guys done? How many of our children would actually be able to answer confidently? And so this man was so inspired by that, by not knowing, that he made that the course of his study to the doctoral level. That's the importance of studying history, that we communicate these things to our children. You know, the children of the Sahaba, they said, our fathers used to teach us, Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas and his son and his grandchildren, they said, our fathers used to teach us Maghazi Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. They used to teach us the seerah of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And they used to say, هَذَا شَرَفُكُمْ وَشَرَفُ آبَائِكُمْ. This is your honor and this is your pride. And this is the pride of your forefathers. So don't squander it, don't lose it. And so one of the greatest gifts that we can give to our children is the gift of simply telling them who you are. And this is who your father is, and this is who your mother is, and this is who your great-grandfather is, and this is the town that we're from. I know sometimes it doesn't seem like they're listening, but they're absorbing. And days become weeks, and weeks become months, and months become years, and years become an identity that is structured and confident and secure. I say what you have heard and I ask Allah Azza wa Jalla forgiveness for myself and for you. أقول ما سمعتم واستغفر الله لي ولكم فاستغفروه. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. As for, in particular, African American history or black history, why is it important? A person can say, well, why do we have to devote a khutbah to this topic? Why this particular group in particular? Number one is because the African American community, their history is our history. When you read that 1/5, and these are modest estimates, that 1/5 of the slaves who are brought over to the United States were Muslim. They were Muslim, 1/5. you're talking about a community that built this country over 400 years with their blood, sweat, and tears. And so I embrace my brothers and sisters and their ancestry, which is part of my history. Just as I embrace Tariq ibn Ziyad from Western Africa, and I say that's part of my history, or the Umayyads and they were part of my history, or the Abbasids and they were part of my history, or Dawlat al-Murabitin and they were part of my history, or Al-Andalus and that was part of my history. Why? Because I am part of an ummah and we are all made of different parts in different lands. Then similarly so, our brothers and sisters from West Africa whose story included them being shackled and placed on ships and traversing an ocean and building a nation that would now be the superpower of this earth, when we recognize that this is part of our legacy as well, then our roots become deeper in this land. And it becomes much harder for people to say that our presence here is unwelcomed, our presence here is illegitimate. It becomes a lot harder for you to say that when you recognize the story of the Muslims in this land goes way beyond the 70s and the 60s and the 50s. But the second point, and the importance of understanding the history, black history, is to appreciate and to give credit where credit is due. Now, it is not a coincidence that the immigrant community, that the majority of us came in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. Well, what was the trigger? America was there before. Why is it that the earliest Muslim communities that are talking about immigrant communities are people from Syria and Lebanon? Why is that? What's the correlation? Well, the correlation is that after the 50s and 60s, when the civil rights struggle happened, and America's public consciousness towards colored people changed within the United States and beyond it, then America consciously began to open the doors to people to immigrate from the colored world. And so Muslims came from Africa, and Muslims came from Southeast Asia, and Muslims came from the subcontinent. And so it is a direct result of the civil rights struggle that our brothers and sisters, who are still, many of them, mashallah, still alive, alhamdulillah. But it is a direct result of their sit-ins and their protests and them having dogs unleashed and them being attacked by fire hoses and police. All of that is a direct result of us being able to come and live in this country in security and peace. And so that is a credit that we owe as immigrant Muslims to our African American brothers and sisters. And the last point that I want to mention, why it is important to understand the African American history, black history in this country, is to build bridges of empathy and understanding, cooperation with one of the largest minorities in this country. I remember a brother once, he was confused when he had a brother approach him for sadaqah, and he was a person who was in charge of charity. And he said, I don't understand why this brother's asking me for charity. This country is their country. The brother who was asking was African American. So this brother is an immigrant brother. He's like, I don't understand. Why can't he pick himself up by the bootstraps? But when you look at somebody, if someone were to say that about the Muslim world, if someone were to say, hey, why are you guys all in such turmoil? Look at the entire Muslim world. It's all civil war and disaster and destruction and corruption. There's such turmoil in your lands. We left your lands 50, 60, 70 years ago. Well, you would say to them, well, colonization, we were colonized for 200 years plus. That's not an injury that you can just walk off. It requires serious physical rehab. It requires psychological rehab. It's going to take us a lot of time. And so if you recognize that with regards to the effects of colonization in the Muslim world, then what do you think about a community that is still suffering from the ramifications of being enslaved for 400 years? Doesn't that make you more willing to empathize? Shouldn't you see that a community that is suffering from the PTSD of slavery, it's not going to be resolved in one generation or two generations or in even three. And so we as a community should empathize with that, should understand that, and should outreach to that, to recognize that many of our brothers and sisters in humanity are coming from generations before where their ancestors were Muslim. We said 1 in 5 of the slaves who came over here. So many of them actually have ancestry that is Muslim. There is history there that is Islamic. And so when we outreach to them, We communicate these things to them. I want to share with you a song that is sung in churches. But I want you to just hear what the words are. And I really believe that this must have been written by a Muslim as they were trying to hold on to their Islam. They said, let us break bread together on our knees. Let us break bread together on our knees when I fall on my knees on my face to the rising sun. My Lord, have mercy on me. When I fall on my knees on my face to the rising sun. My Lord, have mercy on me. Person is describing Salatul Fajr, falling on their knees on their face. And so we have a vast community in this country that already has a Muslim history. They have the roots there, but they are the have-nots, and they're the disenfranchised, and they're the weak, and they're the undesirables. We may not want to approach them, but they are also the ones who are most likely to follow the message of the prophets. Because those are the ones, the disenfranchised and the poor and the weak and the subjugated and the oppressed. Those are the ones who follow the prophets in every day and age, as Heraclius told Abu Sufyan in Sahih al-Bukhari.